En tant que recteur et vice-chancelier de l'Université d'Ottawa, je suis particulièrement heureux de vous accueillir ici cet après-midi. Whenever we gather for an important event like this, it is our custom to begin by offering an Indigenous affirmation in support of reconciliation. Nous rendons hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de cette terre. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date l'unissant à ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons également hommage à tous les peuples autochtones qui habitent Ottawa, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. I would like to warmly welcome each of you to this very timely and ambitious conference. I know that some of you have come from quite far away to be with us this weekend, and it is much appreciated. Having examined the topics to be discussed this weekend and the impressive list of speakers, I have no doubt that your journey will prove to be very, very rewarding. I normally would have been pleased to welcome Mona Nemmer, Dr. Nemmer, but I will pass on this one. Ici, à l'Université d'Ottawa, nous sommes vivement dévoués envers l'avancement de la médecine, du droit et des technologies numériques. Pourtant, si nous sommes réunis ici aujourd'hui, c'est parce que le croisement de ces trois champs, qui se manifestait il n'y a pas si longtemps seulement dans la science-fiction, représente aujourd'hui des défis de taille. The speed with which individuals and institutions are being pushed to respond to the new ethical, legal, medical, and technological challenges is accelerating almost daily. Practitioners, and I would add government staff and civil servants, are often too busy in courtrooms, in their offices, in their operating rooms, to devote the time needed to address these challenges, which is why our work is so important. And I would dare to add that very clearly the work some of you do in artificial intelligence is extremely exciting. It's difficult, it's challenging. It will go on. The technological aspect of AI, I think, is challenging. It's the easy part. The difficult part will be the societal impact and the reaction in terms of ethics, in terms of norms, of technological norms, of legal norms. And that's where the real challenge will lie. That's where the very important conversations will have to be held. And I'm especially thrilled that this will happen partly this weekend. We support these investigations and critical reflections on an ongoing basis at the University of Ottawa, notably at the Center for Health, Law, Policy, and Ethics, merci Colleen, and at the Center for Law, Technology, and Society, which are joint organizers of this conference, this very important conference. You know, AI is everywhere. It's being discussed. What people understand about AI is a perception. And perception becomes reality these days. And the lobbies will be around AI. The government will have to answer to their constituents. But there's only one place where objective conversations can be held, where real conversations can be held in a dispassionate way, or as passionate way also, and it is in universities. And that's why I'm so thrilled that this conversation will be held today here in this room at the University of Ottawa. So I would like to extend my heartfelt congratulations to the leadership of these two centers and to their staff for their hard work in making this conference a reality. It is now my great honor to introduce the Honourable Stephen Goudge, a former Justice of the Ontario Court of Appeal, whose important work leading Ontario's inquiry into pediatric forensic pathology in Ontario in 2008 led to the introduction of significant new legislation governing forensic pathology in this province. It is a great honor for us to have Mr. Justice with us, and c'est donc avec plaisir que je l'invite à prendre la parole. Merci beaucoup et bonne conférence.
Thanks, Jacques. Well, thanks, President Fremont. That was a great kickoff. As you said, this is undoubtedly a wonderfully interesting, challenging, and timely set of subjects we've challenged ourselves with over the next 2 days. I think, as you've said, enormous congratulations go to Professor Flood and her colleagues who put all this together and assembled what really is an all-star team to offer their thoughts that the rest of us are going to have trouble keeping up with and digesting, but are really important. And I'd also like to take a moment to thank the sponsors for their support of this 2-day conference. First is the University of Ottawa. Thank you, President. The Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Canadian Medical Association, the Vector Institute, and the Associated Medical Services. But before introducing our opening keynote presentations, who are duly assembled before you, let me just offer a few general thoughts of my own, which in many ways are a reprise of what the President said. There is no doubt that AI-driven healthcare is the exciting new frontier in medicine. This is brought home to me regularly in my capacity as the chair of the board that delivers pediatric oncology in the province. The medical director there, week after week, tells me of what the new offerings are of AI and what it promises. The generation of data in massive quantities is coming from so many sources, such as high-resolution medical imaging, electronic medical records, genomic sequencing, and so on. And it's being ordered by an increasingly enhanced computer power. So undoubtedly, this will have, indeed it is already having, a profound impact on so much of medicine. Take, for example, clinicians of almost every type. AI provides rapid, accurate image interpretation of scans, slides, retinal images, cardiograms, and much more. For the health system as a whole, it offers better prediction of key outcomes. And for a system that is always inevitably challenged economically, making use as a consequence of that of scarce hospital and community health resources will be an enormous step forward. And for patients, AI, and particularly the deep learning algorithms that may soon enable them to take some of their health care into their own hands, also offers possibilities that are significant. However, the bright new world all this envisages requires caution. As one learned author says, and I've had the opportunity to read a good deal about this preparing for this meeting, quote, "Despite all the promises of AI technology, there are formidable obstacles and pitfalls. The state of AI hype has far exceeded the state of AI science, especially when it pertains to validation and readiness for implementation in patient care. More importantly for healthcare, and especially for us in the justice system, machine medicine sits squarely at the intersection of science on the one hand and law and ethics on the other. Many of the themes that we will be dealing with spring from that reality. Let me just highlight a few of them. First, and perhaps most obviously, the issue of privacy. Personal healthcare information in vast quantities is the fuel that drives machine learning in medicine. How to protect patient privacy rights in this changing landscape? A question. What does informed consent consent mean in the context of AI health technologies? Another question. Setting the privacy bar too low and patient privacy will be jeopardized. On the other hand, setting the bar too high and the advancement of machine learning is slowed. Second, the challenge of human rights. How do we guard against AI tools learning from data sets where some populations are underrepresented? We in the justice system are not unfamiliar with gender and racial biases in these sorts of settings. And once such biases creep in, how will they be detected in a world where, at least as I am told, although I confess I do not understand, AI algorithms will evolve through machine learning in ways that are mysterious, even to the programmers who created them? Third, what about liability for error in a world of machine medicine? A patient harmed by mistaken diagnosis or faulty treatment decisions driven by AI may well be faced with finding new answers to age-old questions. Who did it? The creator of the algorithm, the distributor of it, the healthcare provider who relied on it, or who? Who owed the patient a duty of care? What standard of care had to be met? I can say personally that I'm vastly relieved to have left the bench before these challenges arrive. A fourth consideration is the effect of machine medicine on the empathy and compassion that is so necessary for healthcare providers to accord to their patients. In the context of a first diagnosis of a serious medical condition, will the doctor's message no longer be, "All my experience tells me that you've got lung cancer," but rather, "My machine tells me you've got lung cancer"? Fifth on my list is the pace of change of all this. The Silicon Valley slogan, "Move fast and break things," is surely unacceptable where patient welfare is at stake. How will regulators cope with machine learning that is designed to evolve from fresh data all on its own? How's the patient's safety to be ensured? And what of the regulator's natural instinct to err on the side of overregulation? Do we want to impede the bringing of promising innovations to market, thereby possibly harming patients who could really be helped? So this is the new world of machine medicine that healthcare and law are entering, and it poses huge challenges that are daunting. But it also carries huge promise for the healthcare of all of us that is, after all, priceless. Now, our own challenge here is to explore as much of this as we can in the next day and a half. We're about to hear 4 wonderful presentations about the exciting world of machine medicine and the expectations we can have of it. These presentations were to be led by Dr. Mona Namer, Chief Science Advisor of Canada, but she's unfortunately come down with pneumonia and can't be with us. But she's kindly forwarded some important thoughts that I would like to share with you. This is what she offers. Thanks to substantial early investments in artificial intelligence research, Canada has built world-leading expertise in AI research and has grown a strong talent ecosystem around the concentration of AI expertise in its universities. Canada is also home to leading companies in the field, which now attracts investments from the world's leading technology companies. On May the 3rd, the federal government announced an investment of up to $49 million in the Digital Health and Discovery Platform. It is a collaborative partnership that brings together 100 partners across Canada, including healthcare institutions, small, medium-sized, and large, universities and research foundations, and all 4 major artificial AI research labs in Canada. They will establish a Canada-wide AI platform that will connect to different sources of health data to accelerate research. For example, cancer centers and research hospitals will be able to quickly share data to test theories about how best to treat aggressive cancers and develop better treatments for each patient. In the government's efforts to harness and support this important field, it launched earlier this month the Advisory Council on Artificial Intelligence. That will be a central reference point for government to draw on leading AI experts from Canada, Canadian business, the academy, civil society, and other partners so that we can realize the full economic and social benefits. Specifically, the Council will establish a working group on commercializing value from Canadian-owned AI and data analytics, building on the work started by the Digital Industries Economic Strategy Table. It will also provide on how best to advance the goals laid out in the Canada-France Statement on Artificial Intelligence, and will support Canada's participation in various international engagements such as the G7, the G20, the OECD, and the World Economic Forum. It will guide the Government of Canada's actions as it continues to build an innovative, people-centered, and inclusive digital and data economy. That was the Chief Scientist of Canada. Let me now turn to the last task I have, and it's a welcome one. It's to welcome and introduce the four folks who are going to kick this conference off, seated here beside me. These introductions are cursory, to say the least, given the extraordinary accomplishments of all of them. Let me begin at the far right with Joelle Pineau, co-director of the Reasoning and Learning Lab in the School of Computer Science, McGill University. She's a winner of this year's Governor General's Innovation Award for leading research in innovative, personalized, robot-assisted healthcare. Beside her is Peter Asaro, the Director of Graduate Program and Associate Professor of Media Studies at the New School in New York. Skipping a vacant chair that I'll go and sit in a moment. Next is Nathan Cortez. Nathan is the Associate Dean for Research, the Gerald J. Ford Research Fellow, and the Adelfo Botello Colegio Endowed Professor of Law in Leadership and Latino Studies at Southern Methodist University, Dedman School of Law. And finally, Colleen Flood, who is known very well, I suspect, to all of you. She's the Distinguished Director of Policy and Ethics at the University of Ottawa Center for Health Law. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's your kickoff panel. They will speak one by one, and I thought what we would do is have each of them make their presentation, whether from the podium or seated, and then we'll invite a conversation with all of you, because this interesting subject really encourages a conversation, and I know there will be one. So, over to you, Joelle.
Thank you very much for the introduction, for setting the stage for this evening's presentation. I think I got the interesting task of sort of setting some background in terms of AI. What do we mean? And what kind of technology is being developed? What's some of that potential? I'll talk a little bit more about the hope than the hype, I think, coming at it from a computer scientist's point of view, but I am happy to be challenged on that and several other topics as we move forward with the discussions. I think many of us are hearing about a lot of the potential applications. Transportation is certainly one area where we're going to see a lot of changes. And I think what's important to know, and the reason I bring up this example that's actually quite far removed from some of the more medical applications that we're going to be discussed here, is really to give us a sense of how the technology evolves over time. And so this idea of having autonomous cars has been in the popular culture for several years. And even at the time where I was doing my PhD, now 15 or 20 years ago, we already had cars that presumably could drive by themselves. In fact, one of these vehicles developed at Carnegie Mellon University was able to drive from one side of the US to the other coast, 97% of the time completely unassisted. This was mid-1990s. What those stats don't tell you is that all of that autonomous driving was done in highway conditions where the car stayed in one lane, did not deviate, did not pass anyone, and fortunately all the other cars stayed out of the way. And so that gives you a little bit of a sense is that the vision, the long-term dream is there. Then we move to execution, and we execute on a part of it, and you think that because you're 97% of the time driving autonomously, you're 97% of the way till the end goal. And yet, for the next 20 years, we've gone on to try to improve the technology. Now the technology is a lot more mature. A couple of years ago, I was in the Bay Area, had the opportunity to sit in one of Google's autonomous cars, and it was driving in traffic. It was handling normal signage. It was handling pedestrian bicycles and all that. Those vehicles are still not in Canada because there's a lot of different challenges that come, in particular with the weather, of transferring that technology over here. So that technology evolves over a long time, and trying to understand what it can and it can't do takes some time. It's not just in terms of transportation that we're really seeing the progression of that technology. It's no longer that unusual for some of us to be speaking to a bot, whether on our phones, on our interface. Many of you have probably had that interaction where you're dealing with customer service through a chat interface, and you don't quite know if it's a person or a bot on the other side. Most likely the conversation starts with a bot, and at some point in the interaction, depending on the complexity of your particular problem, gets handed off to a human. Quite unseemingly, you don't necessarily notice that transition. In many ways, most of our interactions with the digital world at this time are mediated by AI system. What information you receive, how it's presented, what information you communicate, how it's presented, how these different pieces of information are manipulated, ranked, and represented. When we talk about artificial intelligence, the term itself, it's interesting to know, doesn't go back that far. 1956, the term artificial intelligence enters the vocabulary following a seminal meeting at Dartmouth College. Dartmouth College, small town. If you drive down to Boston, you might hit it and get through it very quickly. 1956, a dozen researchers came together to pose the foundations of that field. Now, at that time, they spent 2 months on it. Imagine 2 months with no internet, no Netflix, no Facebook, no email. Wonderful things could be done. And really, from that one meeting, they set out the whole landscape of the field, identifying all the key sub-problems that had to be solved. And for the next 50 years or so, the discipline of AI moved with sub-communities tackling every one of these pieces of the puzzles relatively independently. If we contrast that with what's happening in the human brain, actually, there's a big divide. And so we feel like AI is progressing very quickly, but in a sense, we're still in this model of AI where each piece of the puzzle is treated separately. In the human brain, all of these functionalities, whether it's the ability to understand language, to understand images, to represent knowledge, are all integrated in a much seamless fashion. And so of all of these puzzle pieces, really the one that has come to prominence in the last 5 or 6 years is this piece called machine learning. The ability for machines to take data, distill knowledge from that data in a way to make predictions and take decisions. And so from that, there's really 2 eras in the development of AI. That first era, which I'll call the programmatic era, where computers solved seemingly difficult problems by being told specifically what was the goal and being programmed to solve that problem. And that works reasonably well for the class of problems that are specified very precisely. If you're trying to build an AI system to play chess, to optimize some airplane routes, that kind of thing. It doesn't work so well in the case of problems where the specification of the problem is very vague. If you have a task which is look at an image and delineate the location of a tumor in that image, you may need, if you try to follow a programmatic approach, to have a very specific description of what a tumor looks like. That's very hard to do in a concise language that a machine will understand. And so the supervised learning approach goes through the process of presenting several examples to the machine, a sequence of data. On each of these examples, humans have annotated the location of the tumor or the object of interest. So we call it supervised learning because humans are offering supervision as to what is the concept that the AI system should understand from the data. And this works better for several tasks, including image classification, speech recognition, automatic translation, and so forth. One of the reasons we're hearing so much about machine learning is really this rapid growth of available data. I have a graph here that plots just the amount of data that is human created. So this doesn't even represent all the genetics material available in nature. This graph shows you the growth of data starting 2010 at the end, and at the other end, at the right end, we're in 2025. So 2019 is about 2/3 of the way on this curve. 2025, some of the students who are registered here at the University of Ottawa are still going to be in school by the end of that graph. And they're going to have to contend with that peak in terms of opportunities. And so this is why we're seeing such an excitement, effervescence in this particular field. It's interesting to note the data here is measured, the amount of data, the y-axis is measured in zettabytes. I don't know if anyone knows how big is a zettabyte, but think 10 to the 21 and you've got some idea. So those of you who are buying terabyte computers to store all your data are going to have to grow that capacity if you're going to make it to 2025 and beyond. Because I'm a scientist at heart and I want people to get as excited as I am about the science, let me spend a minute giving you an intuition of what is a neural network. We keep on hearing about neural networks, deep learning. I can start with a simple analogy. Those of you who are familiar with a biological neuron, you can think of a neuron in the brain as a very small unit of computation. Information comes in through the dendrites. The neuron at the chemical level takes that information in and makes a decision about what information to send out, and a signal gets sent through the axon to other neurons. In the case of the artificial neural network, very similar system. Information comes in through the input. This is a mathematical signal that goes into the computer. Each artificial neuron computes a function of that information. You can think of it as a simple mathematical equation or just a single line of code. Out of that equation comes a result, a real number, which gets sent out of the neuron. And so the real power of neural networks, both biological neural networks and artificial neural networks, reside in connecting all of these neurons together. Whereas each neuron can compute a simple function, a network of connected neurons can actually compute a very complex function. And so in the language of mathematicians, we call this a universal function approximator, meaning that a neural network, given sufficient data and sufficient compute time, can actually learn any function. And what we try to do in supervised learning is to make the network learn the function that we're interested in. The power of deep learning shows up when you have very large networks. So I'm showing you here one of the networks that has been proposed for analyzing images. It has 600,000 neurons. And in terms of connections between those neurons, there's on the order of millions of connections. So when we are training one of these neurons, we're reinforcing certain connections in order to compute a particular function of interest, the identification of objects and images. And if we want that network to understand many objects, then we have to train it with a lot of data. There's several types of machine learning, and so I'll give you a brief view of that. Supervised learning I've talked about already, where you get some supervision. A human is annotating the information to teach a concept to the machine. This is the kind of technique that's being used mostly, for example, in computer vision, speech recognition. Since 2012 or so, methods based on deep learning are giving results in terms of accuracy that are superior to previous approaches. And furthermore, in the last 3 years or so, the capacity of machines using deep learning to identify objects and images is at the level of humans. We're also seeing that we're moving from giving gross boxes of where an object is to having very precise delimitation of objects. We've used similar technology, not just in normal images, but also in medical imaging. In particular, for example, analyzing EEG images to pick out the timing of seizures for patients with epilepsy. Second category of machine learning is not about just making predictions, but it's actually about choosing actions. And so to do so, we have a class of learning called reinforcement learning. This is inspired by psychology, in fact, behavioral psychology, going back to the days of Pavlov. Many of you may be familiar with this concept that you can train an agent through a system of rewards and punishment. Those of you with pets or young children may have used this. The idea is you present different rewards, different punishments, and that shapes the behavior of the agent. We're using the same strategy with our machine agents. And in doing so, we've had fantastic results. 2016, an agent trained with reinforcement learning was able to play the very complicated game of Go at a level that was sufficient to beat the best human players. This is also a kind of strategy that we've used in our lab and in collaboration with researchers at the Montreal Neurological Institute to train an agent to optimize a neurostimulation strategy, again, for patients with epilepsy. So in this case, the machine learning is used to decide at what time should we be applying electrical stimulation to the brain in a way to reduce the incidence of seizure, and do so while reading in an EEG signal that gives us information about the state of the brain. The third category of learning that I'll talk about today is a category of learning that is called generative learning, where the aim here is to actually create new data. And so this is very recent work. In the last 2 years, we've seen a big rise in this category of work. On the top left over here, 2 images, pretty good looking fellows and ladies. In this particular case, both of these images are completely synthetic. There's no one in the world that looks like these 2 people. They are a composite of a large amount of data. And you may wonder why they're kind of better looking than average, I might think. In this case, they're trained from a data set called celebs. It's a data set that's only images of celebrities. And so that brings out the point that the results you get from these machine learning systems are strongly influenced by the data that you use. And so if you're using all celebrity pictures to train your system, you're going to get pictures that look like celebrities. That opens up a lot of interesting questions in terms of biases that are feeding into our system, which we can tackle later on. Down here below, maybe a more amusing example is the top 2 pictures, classic paintings from the painter Van Gogh. Below, a reimagination of these pictures using an AI system called Deep Dream. What's interesting to note from all of this is whereas you may be worried by the capacity of our AI systems in terms of the quality of the image generation that we're getting, we've recently seen some results where the generation of voices is actually also improving rapidly. There's been some nice samples, nice from a technology point of view, samples produced by a team of researchers at Google in the last few weeks showing very credible generation of someone speaking, and it's not that person, nothing has been recorded, it's purely synthetic. And so one of the things that's on the horizon in the next couple of years is coupling this ability to generate images with the ability to generate sound towards generating some very credible synthetic videos. In much of technology, there's some riskier applications of the technology, and then there's also some more promising applications of the technology. So in the case of generative learning, some of my colleagues have actually applied very similar models as used for reconstructing the faces towards reconstructing MRI images with much faster acquisition process. So whereas imaging of a knee might take on the order of 45 minutes, with this particular strategy, you can take very small number of images and the AI system learns to reconstruct the image in between to the same level of precision as you would if you had completely sampled the image. So there's promising use of that technology in imaging also. I'm going to close proposing a particular model to think about the use of AI, in particular in medicine and healthcare. And I think this may be a useful model for some of our later discussion, which is how is the AI being used, and in particular, how is it being incorporated in the process and the practice of medicine? And so on the first level, I'm calling these levels of autonomy for AI in healthcare. Level 1, I would say, is a system where the AI or the machine learning is used to enhance human perception, to enhance the quality of monitoring of the data. Level 2, the AI doesn't just help monitor the data, it actually makes predictions and diagnoses. Level 3 is going a step further, using these predictions and diagnoses to make treatment recommendations, though we assume there's still a human that is taking these treatment recommendations and deciding on the course of treatment. Level 4 is sort of the full autonomy case, where the AI system is actually applying the treatment directly without a human in the loop. So we may come back to this model if you find it useful. I'm going to close at that point and leave the stage to one of my colleagues. Thank you.
So thank you. I'm going to take this discussion in a somewhat different direction. I've been working in AI ethics and robot ethics for a number of years, though I have a background in AI and machine learning. And I want to talk about a little bit about where I see the medical AI ethics questions fitting in with a larger discussion around AI ethics in general. And in particular, I've just completed a report for the UN Institute of Disarmament Research looking at private sector AI principles. These have become very popular lately. In the last 2 years, there's been dozens of these. So I reviewed these. There's also the national level ones. We heard about the Canada. France has one, US has one. But these are often published by companies. So Google, Microsoft, IBM, Accenture, places like that. There's also sort of ad hoc ones. So there's the Montreal Declaration a few years ago in Montreal, the Toronto Declaration this year, the Asilomar Principles, and then there's a number that have been generated by professional organizations and unions. So there's a large group of union workers that has a set of reports and principles out, the Association of Computing Machinery, the IEEE, and most interestingly for this discussion, the American Medical Association, and also the Academy of the Royal Medical Colleges in the UK. So that's the US and UK. So I'm really going to be commenting primarily on those, and where I see there being a lot of overlap with the AI ethics principles more generally, but also what's kind of interesting about the medical ones in particular, and what the two might learn from each other. And I think our host really set it up well when he talked about the move fast and break things kind of ethos of the IT sector. And in fact, in the foreword to the Royal Medical Colleges report, Professor Carrie McEwen says that really the fundamental tension that runs through the whole report is this ethos of the IT industry of moving fast and breaking things, and the kind of Hippocratic oath or ethic of first do no harm that really permeates healthcare and medicine. And I don't know if we can resolve that tension, but it's definitely there. And I think more generally to think about what are AI principles or ethical principles, one of the big challenges is that when you sort of sit down and think about all the things that AI can be used for, and it can certainly be used for many, many good things, it's really hard because there's so many specific areas, examples, industry sectors, applications. It's enormously complex, and so what you wind up with are very abstract principles. And it's very difficult to think about how to make those concrete and practical, and how does that going to actually guide the design of systems or decisions that practitioners have to make about specific kinds of systems. But largely, both the medical and the more general ones agree on these kind of principles around the importance of the privacy of individuals and the security of data within systems, avoiding bias of various sorts, having transparency so that when something goes wrong or we have systems that we're able to scrutinize how they operate and why they make the kinds of decisions that they make, and that people are accountable and we can get reasons for why things happen and hold people liable if they did something wrong. And ultimately, we want to do good, right? So these are very great principles. Of course, even those alone can often come into conflict. What's the relationship between privacy and transparency in any specific application? There could be a lot of tension there. But it also doesn't tell us a whole lot about some of these questions we might have about, say, medical diagnostics, right? We're clearly trying to do something good, but where do we trust the human? Where do we trust the machine? Why? How do we design systems? But within the two medical reports, I think it's quite interesting that they focus on a much more practical application level. And they very quickly, both reports, separate out whole classes of applications where they think there's really not a lot of problems of an ethical sort or a principled sort. And this is the distribution of materials and resources and planning and all kinds of applications that we already automate, but we don't really worry too much about. But in fact, what we want to worry about is really the clinical applications, where we're actually engaging with patients, making choices that will affect people's lives, and to some extent also these larger kinds of ethical questions around group epidemiology and immunology and things like that. But the patient safety is really crucial, right? Which again is not necessarily a general AI principle, but maybe it should be. but that all of these reports, and the medical practice in particular, is very concerned and puts individuals and humans and patients first and their safety first in all cases. Another thing that's interesting is the degree to which they promote standards. The development of standards by standard-setting bodies. Of course, the IEEE also does this, but they are themselves a standard-setting body. But the other sort of thing that comes up, I guess, in the discussions around AI ethics in particular is the degree to which many companies are maybe avoiding legal regulations and other forms of regulation and sort of doing ethics washing and saying, we have these great ethical principles, we're doing everything right. You don't need to scrutinize too much what we're doing. And I think the medical community is also very forthcoming and embracing of regulation, and saying, both reports say, what we need is really good regulation here, we need regulation here. And they both point to, I think, existing structures within the medical community, particularly in pharmaceuticals, right? Drugs are also very complex. They have enormous types of interactions with the human body. They interact with different people's bodies in very different ways. They can also interact with other drugs in very complex ways. But we have regimes for testing drugs, which we'll hear, I think, a bit about from Nathan, that are actually quite effective at assessing these. They can always be improved and made better, and AI can also be part of making that better. But ultimately, we don't want to just say, well, we don't need any regulation, let's just try everything. We do really want safety there. And of course, inequality and disparity, which I think plays out not just in terms of bias, but again in terms of the differences between human bodies and different populations, that we really need inclusivity of broad swaths of the population and the diversity of population included in our data sets that are going to be making these kinds of medical recommendations and decisions. And ultimately also they argue for the participation of clinicians, user-centered design, and in fact a kind of activism of healthcare providers and doctors and nurses. And I think that's also crucially important. So my other sort of agenda is I have a paper coming out on AI ethics using an ethics of care. And an ethics of care is a feminist ethical philosophy. And in that paper, I'm actually looking at predictive policing. But I think actually ethics of care has a much stronger history in education and healthcare and is a much more natural fit in many ways. But it's very interesting. It's developed primarily by Carol Gilligan from moral psychology and moral development, and thinking about ethics not in terms of, say, consequentialism and deontology, where you have a universal set of rules and principles that everybody must conform to at some level, but instead to think about moral responsibility of the individual and to put that in the context of social relations. Because everything we do and think, when we actually do moral reasoning and moral psychology, is in relation to our social relations, our family, our community, our friends, our bosses, our job and responsibility, in particular in care situations of caregivers and care receivers. And that moral responsibility is deeply situational and contextual, and it's not always productive to have these kind of universal principles that are supposed to be one size fits all. But because of this embeddedness in social relations and situationality, it's also very difficult to think about, well, how do I design a system that helps somebody do that? But Joan Tronto has kind of 4 principles that are very useful for thinking about this, which is attentiveness to the needs of somebody receiving care, responsibility taking, so responsibility not just as being able to blame somebody or hold somebody responsible or accountable when things go wrong, but that the people who are providing care actually take a responsibility for the care that they're giving and the relationship that they're entering into, that they're also competent. And this is crucial, particularly in the evaluation of these systems. So when we're evaluating drugs, we want to make sure that they actually work, things like that. And I think with medical AI, we're going to really want to have strong mechanisms for doing that. And that ultimately it's also responsive, which means that patients have an input into the system. And I think all of these together kind of point to a human-driven AI in medicine rather than AI-driven medicine. And I think there's an interesting subtle difference in the titles between the US and the UK reports. The UK report is Artificial Intelligence in Healthcare, and the American Medical Association is Augmented intelligence in healthcare, and that we should really think of this as a tool that's augmenting our healthcare providers and our doctors and nurses, and not something that is this autonomous driving force. And I think this comes back to human-centered design, of designing systems that actually allow care providers to exercise morality, to exercise the ethics of care in their professional capacities. And we can think about analogies to judges and laws that say restrict judges and their sentencing decisions versus giving judges the ability to use discretion to meet the demands of specific complex cases, or to interpret the law in very specific contexts, or to soldiers in battle being able to make decisions about the use of lethal force versus writing a piece of code that would do that automatically, or in the case of doctors, programs that would tell doctors what to do rather than allowing doctors and nurses and other healthcare providers to decide what is really best and most appropriate in the specific context they are. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Nathan.
All right. First, before I begin, I want to congratulate Colleen and Florian for organizing a wonderful conference. I'm really excited for tomorrow's sessions, and I think I'll learn a lot. What I'd like to do is to place our current moment in some historical context. So how long has AI in medicine been in the works? Did we see this coming? And did we foresee the ethical and legal and social challenges that we're grappling with now? So medical algorithms are not entirely new. They actually date back to the 50s and 60s with the earliest computer systems. So here's a 1967 article in the New York Times discussing how the US Public Health Service developed a computer system to analyze electrocardiogram signals. And the test, as you can see in the highlighted sections, involved an ECG performed in France, which was then relayed to a computer in Washington, D.C., which sent its analysis back to France by satellite in under 30 seconds. So you can find similar stories in the archives from around this time. So there's really a long history of computerized medicine that roughly parallels the history of computing itself, and it's a fascinating history. Around that time, physicians started contemplating the implications of computerized decision-making in medicine. So here's a 1970 article in the New England Journal of Medicine noting that several articles over the past decade considered the use of computers as an adjunct to medical decision-making, but also observing that few had considered how computers might fundamentally alter the role of the physician. So Dr. Schwartz here, the author, speculates that algorithms might be used to monitor physician performance. And it says, if the computer comes to play a major part in diagnosis and treatment, the computer system itself can readily be used to evaluate physician performance. And special programs could collect information on the frequency with which consultations are requested, the numbers and types of questions asked, et cetera, et cetera. Around the same time, a separate article argued that eventually it would be malpractice not to use computers to diagnose and treat patients. So again, this is back in the 60s and 70s where doctors and medical professionals were contemplating the ethical use of computerized decision-making. Policymakers, as you might imagine, were a little slower to respond, as we might expect. So on the left, we have a 1978 committee hearing from the US House Committee on Science and Technology, which held hearings titled Computers in Healthcare. And it focused mostly on the benefits of computers, using automation to reduce spending, to reduce the incidence of errors, to improve access in underserved areas. And on the right, we see the same committee, the House Committee on Science and Technology, holding hearings on health information systems. So I read the transcripts from these hearings and several other congressional hearings around the time, And for the most part, Congress was interested in how computers could make healthcare more efficient and reduce errors. The focus at that time was not regulation. You can go through hundreds of pages of transcripts and not find one reference to the US Food and Drug Administration. No one from the FDA or HHS was asked to testify. So in fact, our aspirations and our anticipation of the problems greatly outpaced our consideration of the legal and regulatory issues. And again, our aspirations have always outstripped reality until perhaps recently. So here's a scene from Star Trek with Dr. McCoy using the medical tricorder to diagnose a patient. So for those not familiar, for those who aren't Trekkies, the tricorder pictured up at the top left corner was the mythical universal diagnostic device that could instantaneously diagnose patients. So back in the 60s, sci-fi writers were fantasizing about a universal instantaneous diagnostic machine and what they might be able to accomplish. These notions persist today. Here's a clip from the 2014 Disney movie Big Hero 6. So this giant marshmallow-like figure is Baymax, a robotic personal health assistant who can instantaneously diagnose and treat medical conditions. And the programmer standing behind Baymax, named Tadashi, explains that this is going to help a lot of people. This is going to help a lot of people. So as this conference will explore, there are a number of fascinating but really tricky questions raised by the use of AI and machine learning in medicine. So for example, how do we ensure these things work? How do we ensure that they're safe and effective and they do what they claim to do? Who should be able to use these machines? Should it be people with medical training? Should it be health professionals, people with licenses? What technologies should patients be able to use? And parents, for example, caregivers. Will expert algorithms threaten physician autonomy? Ultimately, will it become medical malpractice not to use expert decision-making by computers, computer-aided diagnosis and treatment recommendations? Will machines fundamentally alter the doctor-patient relationship? We already hear stories of physicians who are peppered with questions from the patient who educated themselves on WebMD or on the Mayo Clinic website or on some other website. So how will AI change things? Will there be legal liability for the use of AI or the misuse or even the non-use? What about institutional uses? Do hospitals have to clear and approve the use of apps and machines and devices by their own staff members? What are the legal and ethical implications of using machines to make rationing decisions, to decide how to deploy scarce medical resources? What do hospitals think about this? So what's fascinating to me is that many of the questions up here on the screen were things that policymakers and lawyers and regulators and physicians were thinking about back in the 60s and 70s. All of these questions sound in the discussions decades ago, but we still haven't resolved them yet. 50, 60 years later, well, maybe not, 40, 50 years later, we still haven't resolved these questions. So I want to explain that kind of the consensus that emerged in the 1990s was the so-called standard view. And the standard view was that artificial intelligence was nowhere close to being intelligent enough or having the data or the speed or the processing power to simulate true clinical decision-making, to replicate what physicians were doing. So the wisdom, according to the standard view, was that physicians should not rely on computers to trump human decision-making. But the standard view may not be valid anymore. How valid is it, given advances in computing power, processing power, speed, methods, memory, and the availability of extremely large data sets? The standard view was that humans will outperform computers, and the standard view is weakening day by day. What's interesting is that the ethical questions beg a fundamental empirical question. who should use algorithms, under what circumstances, how do we ensure they work, et cetera, those questions will always be tied to the empirical question of whether such uses improve net patient outcomes. So Kenneth Goodman emphasizes here, the overarching question may be put thus: does the new technology improve patient care? If the answer is affirmative, we may suppose we have met an important responsibility. If the answer is negative, it seems clear we should not use the new technology. This is a binary way to phrase it. The problem is, we often don't know how to answer the question. So I'd argue that this empirical question, does it improve net patient outcomes, is one that should be facilitated or even answered by regulators, by expert regulators who can require robust data, who can be independent, who can generate information that otherwise would not be generated when left purely to market mechanisms. So I've been thinking about this for a few years, and I'm still not sure what the best approach is. So let me close with this quote. It says, the debate over medical software regulation represents one of the most important controversies of the computer age. The balancing of risks and benefits, as well as public safety and technological progress, means that scientists, clinicians, and policymakers, and many, many more, have one of civilization's most interesting and challenging tasks. So we may not have answers now, but I'm looking forward to pursuing those answers with everyone else. Thank you.
Okay, do I just click ahead? All right, hi everyone, and bonjour and welcome to Ottawa. Thank you to my panel. Thank you to Justice Goudge for filling in for Mona. We found out about 2 hours ago she was down with pneumonia. Then we found out the back of the room is flooding. But I'm here, and my last name is Flood, so we're kind of going with the role here. So thank you for coming out for this plenary panel, and for those of you sticking around for the conference tomorrow. I just want to correct some misassumption here. This event is very much a co-organized event with my colleague Florian, who is the director of the Center for Law and Technology. So I'm getting a lot of credit because I took the seats up here, but you'll see Florian on deck tomorrow. So thank you very much, Florian. I think I'm a little bit more optimistic. I'm a little bit more with Joelle about where I see the advent of AI innovation coming into healthcare. And it seems to me from the evidence that we are soon to see a huge amount of AI innovation being adapted into healthcare systems, whether you like it or not. And in particular, deep learning, which, as we have learned, involves pattern recognition using deep neural networks. It's going to be used to, as Joelle said, to track patient data, diagnose disease, make treatment decisions, and deliver care. There, I said it. So it's happening. So what I'd like to do in my 10 minutes is to reiterate a couple of the points that some of the others have made, and maybe just add a bit of nuance on a few things. Try to scope out some of the, maybe a little bit more, the legal questions that we will wrestle with a bit more tomorrow. So I think that the evidence that we're seeing is particularly with respect to image analysis. So in the fields of radiology, pathology, dermatology, ophthalmology, that these will all be relatively radically transformed fairly quickly, already starting to be so. And that we have evidence in the pipeline that AI can outperform humans in terms of accuracy, certainly in terms of speed. And that's partly because it doesn't need a bathroom break and it doesn't get bored, right? So it can do things that we as humans just simply can't do. Now, a bit of a caveat, like a lot of the evidence so far isn't actually in clinical settings. So it's, you know, your radiologist sitting in a nice lab competing with a machine. And so it probably will be different when we actually get it out into clinical settings and see, you know, maybe the humans will perform slightly better in real time. But I think that the evidence is fairly strong about the relative benefits of AI. So this is an example, whoops, jumped ahead. This company, Artery, developed a medical imaging platform in a cloud-based format where doctors provide de-identified data directly into the platform, and that helps cardiologists diagnose heart problems. So it's a self-teaching artificial neural network which has learned from thousands of MRI scans so far and will continue to prove its knowledge and understanding of how the heart works with each new case it examines. So on the whole, the hope is that AI in healthcare will result in safer and better healthcare for all. And I think sometimes there's a little bit of an over-romanticization about what we have now. Right? So that what we have now is so fantastic and that these evil machines are likely to be worse. I think we need to remember that more patients die from iatrogenic injury, which is injury caused by physicians, nurses, and other health professionals than they do in car accidents. So we have a lot of error that occurs right now, right? So we're hoping that on the whole, AI in healthcare will improve safety and quality of healthcare, but of course, sometimes errors will happen. Sometimes there will be mistakes made, undoubtedly. And if the AI device has become ubiquitous, it has become the standard of care, then those mistakes could be very, very big. They could be system-wide and they could be deeply problematic and many people could be harmed, right? So currently, if you get a bad doctor, not all doctors are bad, so only the patients of that particular doctor. Most doctors are good, sorry. Most doctors, anyway, you know what I mean. So only those patients will be harmed in that scenario. So some of the harms that could come about is because of how humans see things and how AI sees things, and Joelle has already explained this. So sometimes we will see a horse, and for some reason the AI sees a zebra. And this is because of that they see things called adversarial images. I don't really understand this, but I'm sure Joelle can tell us more. These have small changes within them that people don't see, but AI does. Okay, and so a lot of fun can be had on the internet with AI getting things mixed up, you know, donkeys mixed up with cats and things like that. And that's all very funny until you're actually, you know, the machine is not seeing an obvious tumor because of some problem. And of course, they're working on this to try to fix it, but that is part of the worry. The other worry is this issue around bias, which Peter and others have already mentioned. So here we see AI outperforming physicians in terms of detecting skin cancer, looking at skin cancer. And remember, a lot of this might be done by your family doctor, and there's often mistakes made at that point. So AI can definitely assist here. But the trouble is that we have this problem of garbage in and garbage out. So much of the data that the AI is using here is coming from Caucasians. And so there is the distinct possibility that it will misdiagnose for people who have different skin colors. So that is one of the issues that has to be dealt with and problematic in terms of bias, and so where we may see mistakes. Okay, so mistakes may happen. What do we do, right, in response? So here are some of the legal issues that I think that we have to wrestle with. By no means a complete list, and they kind of relate to each other. So I think the first thing we're already seeing will be contracts, agreements where manufacturers and programmers are going to try to transfer the liability to physicians, institutions, the sort of idea of the learned intermediary. And obviously this is going to be a big issue for institutions and physicians when they are leasing or buying AI devices or support. Where does the liability fall, and what are you signing away when you sign that contract? And that is particularly so because how will physicians be able to hold themselves out to their patient and saying, I am using this machine and diagnosing and treating you, trust me, right? Trust is a very important part, but how can they look them in the eye and say, well, you can really trust me because I know how this thing actually works? Not unless they have particular training, you know, they don't really know. So this is a question for training, but also if they are saying that this is the standard of care, trust me, then what responsibility, what burden do they have in that relationship? As we've already mentioned, Michael Frumkin is here, he's written with my colleague Ian Kerr about the problem of liability for harm from not using AI. And, you know, there's a lot of talk nowadays about physicians who use AI and those who don't, and that will be a big divide going forward. And there may be differences between rural regions where it's difficult to perhaps get good internet access, good bandwidth as well. I think this is a really interesting question, a couple of folks have mentioned it as well, is what do we do when there's disagreement between the AI and the clinician or clinicians? And to some extent, we should expect that because we will expect the AI more likely to be right, let me be clear. So the clinician is probably wrong. But there may be circumstances where the clinician is actually right because of bias or some problem with the AI machine. So who should trump in those circumstances? And within hospitals, we have committees, you know, rounds and these kinds of things where we could probably duke it out and decide what we will do. But this leads to the next problem, is that there's likely to be widespread use of AI outside of traditional healthcare settings and not under the umbrella of safety measures taken within hospitals, and perhaps not even under the auspices of physician oversight. So many other healthcare providers, and this may be well be really, really good, for example, in long-term care homes and in home care settings with personal support workers with basically no training whatsoever using AI devices. And I've already mentioned entrenching and deepening problems and discrimination. So some of my colleagues here, Simon Hatcher is working on a digital psychiatrist. I know that Joelle is working on interesting questions around that as well. Another colleague, Abed El-Sadiq, is working on this idea of a digital twin. If I had more time, I'd spend more time telling you about it, but it's just fascinating. But all of these innovations, I think, raise real questions around privacy, and which Justice Goudge actually touched on more than anybody so far, this problem and worries about privacy and how we should respond. And I think, as most of you know, am I really running out of time? You're going to do like, okay. Privacy laws generally require consent for the collection, use, and disclosure of personal health information. And the entire, though, caregiving unit surrounding the patient, which we call usually the circle of care, that is covered by the patient consent. So it's assumed that within the circle of care, the nurse and the other healthcare providers, that the patient has given consent to the use of their personal health information. And so one question yet to be answered is whether artificial intelligence systems that support clinical decision-making are part of the circle of care, because they're going to be collecting data. So are they part of the circle of care and consent is assumed, right? An AI system in this circumstance might be viewed as an agent of the physician delivering care, with the physician, in this case, considered a health information custodian for the purposes of our legislation, holding legal responsibility for ensuring that AI systems handle the information in compliance with the law, right? So it's an agent of the physician. But this then presents its own challenges. Are physicians actually competent to judge whether reams of patient data being uploaded into the black box of the AI algorithm are being effectively de-identified, securely stored, and so on? Right, so I think that's going to be a bit tricky. And then we're also collecting data in all sorts of new and interesting ways that we never have before with the Internet of Things and devices that are being implanted into human bodies and collecting data from there. So I'm just going to finish with a couple of quotes about privacy. One is more the worry about privacy, which we often hear from colleagues, obviously, in law. We always are the doom and gloom folks thinking about the worst case scenario. Sign us up, that's how we make money. So from the University of Sydney, privacy should have a deeper purpose than the one ascribed to it by those who treat it as a currency to be traded for innovation. which in many circumstances seems to actually mean corporate interests. To protect our privacy, we need a better understanding of its purpose and why it's valuable. Okay, so you can't just take some utilitarian calculus and say privacy here, innovation and economic growth there, see ya privacy. No. But on the other hand, I was at a conference in New Orleans last week, and this guy, Dr. Daniel Kraft, he's an AI innovator, a doctor at Singularity University. He's got completely the opposite view, and I think we're probably going to have that view, this division of views within this room, is that we need to advance without fear. We should move towards a place where donation of data is treated the same way as we think about donation of organs or blood, something to be encouraged and supported as an altruistic venture. Now, it does seem to me, though, the difference, of course, is that he's proposing to take my data, if he could get hold of it, which is probably quite easily because I'm a goof when it comes to that sort of stuff, and then sell it back to me in the form of an innovation which would be extremely highly priced and perhaps not able to be afforded by the public healthcare system, which I luckily live within, or anybody else, right? So that's the worry I think that we have, is how then we've put all this funding into public healthcare systems, into public data systems. We want to enable this innovation, but then how do we capture the benefits of it, particularly for Canadians, if it's Canadian data and Canadian effort and ingenuity that has gone into those public healthcare systems, as opposed to innovators potentially in other jurisdictions. So I think that's a bit of a tricky part, and it sounds like the Council for Artificial Intelligence, which our colleagues Ian Kerr and Teresa Scaza here, who have been appointed onto, are going to solve that for us. Thank you, Teresa. So I think that's a really hard part. So thanks a lot, and I'll hand it over to Steve for some Q&A with you guys.
Well, thank all four of you for enormously stimulating presentations. You've all been sitting there patiently absorbing this, and I'm sure it's generated a ton of questions and thoughts and comments in your own minds. So why don't I simply open it up and ask if anybody would like to take a first cut at questioning, challenging, or commenting on what you've just heard for the last hour.
Those are all wonderful, so thank you. This, I think, is for you, Professor Pineau, your first and last slides. I think the use of the autonomous vehicle as an example, I think, particularly for liability purposes, we often think of it as the canary in the coal mine. And your 97% comment, and then at the end, your 4 levels of autonomy. And as we know, autonomous vehicle regulators are working through those kinds of ideas. Now, if you look at autonomous vehicles, the AI is basically being developed to avoid humans, to predict human stupidity, human error, and avoid it. Whereas AI in medicine, particularly as we run down your autonomy scale, is about engagement with humans. And I wondered where you think we are in percentage terms on that, and also perhaps with a little more depth, how the AI will engage with the patient.
I think those are really interesting observations, and I must say, you know, my proposal of the autonomous level is inspired from what we've seen in transportation. The context that you point out in that the type of engagement between the AI system, the physical system, whether it be healthcare or transportation, and then the humans in that system is very different. For the one part on the transportation side, you know, several people want to be relieved of the responsibility to drive, and there's certainly good agreement that if we could have high assurance about the system being fully safe, we would want to do that. On the healthcare side, this is people who have gone through a lot of training, who this is their job. And so the dynamics of it are very different. The level of engagement is very different. There's many people who think that on the transportation side, some of the levels of autonomy that have been specified are not at all feasible. So the level where, the machine is making suggestions of actions, but the human is expected to sit there and monitor and sort of check off on the actions, that on the driving side, that's not realistic at all. Whereas I think that on the healthcare side, that's a very viable model where the AI system is making recommendations and there's actually clinician, physician in the loop taking these recommendations, incorporating their own complementary knowledge and using that. So I think the levels of autonomy don't necessarily line up because of the different dynamics that we see between the two systems. I think one of the things that Colleen pointed out applies to both of them, which is the fact that I expect in both cases, for a majority of cases, if we get to where we want to be, there will be many, many applications where the AI system will be performing better than the human. And so overall, we will see much less fatalities on the road once we have autonomous vehicle. And in at least some sectors of healthcare, we will see better treatment outcomes once we have fully automated system. That being said, there will be errors in both cases. And we have to start thinking about how do we compose with these errors from a legal and an ethical point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps how do we regulate the pace of change to get there?
Mm-hmm.
Comments?
I would just, one of the things I'm actually going to talk about tomorrow is this idea of additive or augmentation. So physicians being augmented by artificial intelligence. And a lot of people seem very comfortable there, much more comfortable than with replacement. And I'm more of an economist really than a lawyer, and that worries me. Because it seems to me that if we're keeping very high and costly physicians in the loop at the same level and adding more high and costly technology, all of this has to be worth it in terms of cost effectiveness, not just in terms of wouldn't it be nice. So there are some really very big questions that will have to be asked about if that's the path that we take forward, where we're just adding it to our existing kind of workforce about cost effectiveness. So the cost is a big issue, I think. And I'm interested that, I think when I'm talking to physicians, they seem a lot, that seems a lot more comfy and cozy than this idea of being supplanted completely and in any kind of domain. And one can understand that, but, from a public policy perspective, it may not always be the case that that's actually in the best interest of everyone.
Colleen, the lawyer in me wants to ask all of you, clearly what you said all throw up in different ways. The notion that we're in uncharted waters here, and there has to be some thought or nod towards how is there some form of regulation or order established to this enormous evolution? And I'd like to ask each of you, and I'd be interested in the two folks from the United States, how do you foresee that regulatory regime unfolding? And is it going to be different in Canada than in the United States? Is it going to be institutional-centered or government-centered? I'd really be interested in the thoughts of the four of you. Nathan?
So, in the United States, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has been very hands-off. It has been active in engaging with the technology. It has not been very forceful in setting standards or taking what we might call hard law regulatory positions, enforceable regulatory positions. A lot of it's soft law through guidance, information, exhortation, but very few regulatory actions. The FDA is...
Is that they don't know what to do, or that that's the preference?
I think a little bit of both. I think 7, 8, 9 years ago, it was they didn't know what to do. I think that excuse is evaporating as they develop more internal expertise. I think also politically the FDA gets pressured from Congress and from industry and from constituents and patients not to overregulate. And you hear this steady refrain in public workshops and documents where the FDA is very careful not to stifle innovation. And the irony is I think that the innovation and real advances would move forward a lot more quickly if the FDA were to take action against the low-hanging fruit, the products, the programs that make promises they don't keep. There's a lot of low-quality innovation on the market. And so, one of the former FDA commissioners, Margaret Hamburg, once said, it's not innovative if it doesn't work. And I agree with that. That's one of my slides tomorrow, to steal my own thunder. It's not innovative if it doesn't work. Well, how do we know if something works? Well, clinical trials, perhaps, novel methods of developing some valid clinical association and clinical validity. The FDA is doing a lot to keep up with these standards. What kind of evidence base do we require of these products? But the FDA scrutiny applies to a very, very small subset of all the products out there. The vast majority aren't going to undergo any sort of regulatory scrutiny. And the scrutiny will be a decentralized network of insurers deciding whether to cover something, hospitals deciding whether to adopt it, physicians deciding and patients deciding whether to download it. So it's going to come through payers, venture capitalists, hospitals. You're going to have this network of people making decisions on an individualized, decentralized basis, and the amount of centralized regulatory review by expert regulators is going to be very, very small.
Peter, I know you have a real focus on, sorry, did you have a question? Way you go.
I think like any other innovation or an evolving innovation in medicine, this sort of technology will have to be in a number of different settings, different patient populations, will have to be tested either in conjunction with or against, as we've been talking about, against physicians so that it can demonstrate its efficacy, its failure rate, positive sensitivity in terms of making diagnosis and specificity, positive predictive value, all of those sort of things. And then in terms of, all these things as we evolve, where does it actually, how does it perform? And that has to be something that's grant funded and has to really, show itself to physicians and to patients to get their confidence. I think that's where it has to go.
Yeah, so
there's one thing you can't teach a machine to do, and having been a physician for a long time, you cannot teach a machine to do a physical exam.
Yet.
Comments from?
Yeah, I think the worry is we're in some kind of wild west of kind of AI stuff, right? And how do we separate the AI snake oil from the actual medicine that works? And I think that kind of FDA model is the way to go. Politically, whether they want to embrace that or not, I think is the question. And what we've seen in the last 20 to 30 years of, say, privacy regulation, which has been very lax and very guideline and soft law-ish, has resulted in a sort of massive loss of privacy. Now, there's much stricter laws around medical records and education records in the United States. And so what you see there is a much stricter and better control and regulation of that information. It's still very complex in the medical records and education records fields, but it's managed and it's regulated. And we don't want to be in that Wild West situation. I don't think it is really this trade-off between purely it's a human who makes the decision or it's a machine. It's always going to be the human working with the machine at some level. And we need to think about what that relationship is, what that responsibility is, and that the machines that they're using are working. But I think there's also this whole set of people diagnosing themselves. What does this mean for the hypochondriacs? Is this going to enable them? Is it going to detect hypochondria and let them know that they're, right? And it gets into questions of holistic medicine as well of, okay, we see that you're having lots of injuries. Is that because you're in an abusive relationship? Or is there something else going on? Like, where are we really in terms of understanding patient care? And I think ultimately, it's all cost definitely matters, and it's about accessibility to larger populations. But it's also that automation allows fewer workers to be more productive. That's the nature of automation. But we also want to ensure that what they're producing is a high quality healthcare.
I just want to point out an interesting example that may complement some of the ideas here, which goes back to the example of the AI system playing Go. I spoke about it very briefly. Go is a game a little bit like chess or checkers, very complex. And for years, we thought this was way out of the reach of AI systems. 2016 system by Google DeepMind comes out, beats the best humans in the world, and does so in playing a very different form of the game. So the strategy was different, and the strategy to win was things that humans had never seen before, such that during the game, humans thought the machine was going to lose for sure, and then it turns out that the machine had developed a whole new strategy for winning. Now, what's interesting there is that since that time, there's a really new era of how humans play Go. Humans observed how the machine was doing it, and it opened up a whole new line of strategies of how humans play it, presumably better than before. At this time, the best systems that we have are a combination of humans and machines, but the humans got there by observing the machine play on its own. And so sometimes when you let the AI system on its own, it opens up new ways of solving problems that humans don't see. And an analogy to that is the work that we've done on neurostimulation, where we use reinforcement learning to train the neurostimulation strategy. And if you look at the strategy that's used by the AI system or that's proposed, it's very different in terms of complexity to any strategy that a human would design. Just the level of complexity is in a totally different category. And so I think there's still some case to at least have a model that enables some cases where the AI system may act on its own, and it may be that we need to go through that phase of the AI system acting on its own to go back to a system where the AI and the humans work better collaboratively, and we get to a higher level in terms of effectiveness.
And if I can, I think a lot of people are fixated on understanding the black box aspect of machine learning. If the programmers themselves don't even understand how the machine spit out its result, how can we possibly audit it and ensure that it works? We've been approving medicines in the US for decades based on a rough idea of how they work. I remember as an attorney in private practice looking over the long physician labeling for a copper IUD, intrauterine contraceptive. I remember the FDA-approved labeling had this language saying, we don't quite know why the copper serves as a way to prevent pregnancy, but it does. And it was approved for use based on results, based on safety and efficacy, and they didn't fully understand the science. So I think measuring AI in comparison to results, how do physicians diagnose? How accurately how accurately does the AI compare to that? And what are the outcomes? I think outcome measurement is more important than any process type of.
I think we can go one step further with this analogy, which is, at least in the transportation side, when there's a situation with an accident, there's a sense that if an AI system is driving, it's going to be a black box. Whereas if a human is driving, we understand what's going on. In fact, with the AI system, we can audit the system much more precisely than we can the human brain.
Question.
So it's a terrific conversation. Thank you all. Thanks to all the speakers. I think there's a whole other class of actors or devices, what do you want to call them, in the health sphere that are poorly regulated and we don't understand well. They're called physicians. So I'm a doctor. I see patients, and if I think about patients that I've seen and I think about them 2 or 3 days later, I may really wonder, why did I make that decision? I can't really retrace all the steps. I don't know what it was at that time that led me to a particular decision. It could have been the right decision, could have been the wrong decision. But we don't really understand our own thinking in many cases. And that, for better or for worse, that's just the reality of how it is. So I guess my take on this is actually relatively optimistic. I think, first of all, I think that we have more time than we think we do. Just to figure this out, because I would distinguish, so some of the examples that were given are really quite distinct. The examples of classification, is that a malignant melanoma or not? Is that a tumor on that CT scan or not? Those are problems that are being solved very rapidly by technology, and those are, frankly, among the simplest of problems, and we understand those problems very well. They're very different from the problem of does this patient, what is the appropriate treatment for this patient? How will we manage their complications from that particular chemotherapy? And that is the area where we've seen that AI has yet to really perform well. Watson Health being a great example of a failure in that domain. So it sounds like we have more time, to sort of sort out how are we going to adapt those measures into our practice of medicine. And the example of autonomous cars, which has taken 20, 30 years to figure out, my understanding, I'm not by any means expert in this field, is that that's actually a much simpler problem in many ways than the problem of prediction, diagnosis, and treatment planning in healthcare. So all that to say that I think we have more time. Mm-hmm. I wonder if the panel has some comments on the question of classification versus prediction, what the differences are in those two examples, from not just from a health side, but also from a legal and ethical side.
Comments?
Well, just on the car analogy, I mean, there's another sense in which if we prohibited human drivers, it'd be a much simpler problem to solve, right? So a lot of the complexity is the humans. But again, this doesn't work in the healthcare sphere because the whole point is taking care of humans. And then humans are the complexity, right? And so we're not going to eliminate that complexity, and we're going to have to manage it. And that's why I think we want humans to be the ones managing it with the best tools and information that have been well regulated and tested at their disposal to try alternatives. And then there's also this kind of meta level, right, which is all of that's going to generate more data. And so how we manage healthcare, how we actually organize our healthcare system can itself be optimized to produce better results. And so this kind of also comes back to your question about, you have such a lovely public healthcare system here. I'm so jealous. And we have this insane private system in the United States. And a lot of healthcare problems are because of the organization of that overall system, right? And if AI could help us fix that, it would be great, but I don't see the pathway to that.
Colleen?
Oh, I think that, to me, Michael, the issues around risk, and so it may be true that classification may be an easier problem ultimately to solve for AI than prediction. I'm not sure about that because some of the things that I've seen that Joelle is working on is apropos of prediction. So things are in the pipeline for sure. But of course, if you're predicting what's going to happen to me with the cold or you're misclassifying my tumor, I'm more worried about the former than the latter. And so I think this issue around risk classification is how historically we've approached it with the FDA and Health Canada. So figuring out, what is the level of risks that we're talking about with a device or a drug or whatever it is, and that then kicks in a certain level of regulatory attention. I think the push has been from the AI folks to move away from that and more towards self-regulation, trust us, we're Google kind of thing. I think that's a mistake both for the industry and for the public. I think it would be bad for the industry if one thing or a couple of things go wrong relatively early on. There'll be such a pushback. There will be a whole lot more regulation than you ever wanted to in the history of the world, probably, in response to that, and will put a chill on the innovation for a time. So I think, sound, clear, not too crazy, but enough regulation is the sweet spot. So how to kind of make that happen, and where possible for that to be aligned across jurisdictions so that innovators. In Canada, we have 10 provinces and 3 territories. You just knock yourself out trying to figure out the rules from one to the other. You're exhausted. So if we can align our rules where how they come into the healthcare system is very much a province-by-province question. The approval of the drug or device itself, but then whether or not it's funded, for example, is really largely a question of at a provincial level. And just one other point there. I think that we're talking about a very heterogeneous kind of bunch of stuff. And that's part of the problem, is there's a lot of stuff that's, decision support tools, et cetera, and then there's probably like a bunch of stuff that's just snake oil and smoke and mirrors. And though, as we increasingly are learning in the healthcare system, though, that can be very dangerous as well. So it's not prima facie dangerous, right? It's like, okay, well, knock yourself out, use your Fitbit, run around, send it to your doctor, what do we care? Except to the extent that it then causes a big problem in the public healthcare system in one way or another, or the private system if you're in the private system.
Great.
So,
We probably have time for 2 more questions, and there happen to be
sorry,
two.
and then there are drinks.
Yeah,
so we really...
two folks standing in the microphone. So front mic first.
Thank you very much. I'm a chief medical officer, and my 2 closest friends are the chief legal counsel and the head of bioethics. But it's always good to personalize things. So I just beyond the rapid pattern recognition like dermatology, the more interesting applications are the ones that integrate multiple sources of data. There's a publication in radiology that puts 8 years of chart data together with all kinds of scans. And so I want to turn it around a little on you and use the example of law and bioethics. Because taking a lot of complicated data over many years and filtering through that, I guess probably this is done by articling students and bioethics students, and then taking all that and then applying a framework and coming up with some preliminary recommendations sounds a lot like what I think maybe you guys do, which is very much like what we do. So could you, if you're willing, comment just on the degree to which it might transform those aspects of health practice?
The health? Oh, the litigation of...
Health law and bioethical judgment.
Yeah, are judges a doomed species? That sort of thing.
Well, one thing I heard recently at a conference, at a workshop, was that humans are basically sophisticated pattern recognition devices. So, you know.
I mean,
It's a very good question.
They're certainly moving towards that, using artificial intelligence for discovery, which is when we're reading bucket loads of, thousands, if not millions of documents and trying to assess which are relevant to the litigation and which aren't. And so firms are starting to use artificial intelligence for that. And just as in medicine, the issue comes up, well, how do you really learn anything then? Because you certainly don't learn it at law school. No, sorry. You learn a lot at law school, but you don't learn your kind of, 10,000 hours on the job, which is kind of what you do as an articling clerk so that you can become an expert. So there is this worry about how then will they acquire that expertise.
But I do think there's an analogy there. Let me offer 2 aspects of it, okay? One of the things that I would analogize to, in effect, the diagnostic aspect of medicine is what sentence is imposed for a particular crime, okay? When I sat on the Court of Appeal, there were reams of information about what had been done in similar circumstances, and that gave a range of possible outcomes, not unlike reading a scan and producing a definition of what the tumor, what its outline was. However, when you say, how do you decide whether somebody is guilty? The circumstances are so varied that the data input required, if you were ever going to try to transpose that to the artificial intelligence world, would be hugely daunting. And so I take some comfort for future judges from the last question that we're some distance from AI being applied in any kind of rigorous way for treatment, whereas we may be very close in the medical context to being able to apply it universally for some form of diagnostics. So I actually think there is a significant analogy, and I think it's interesting to point it out. Last question, and then we're going to go for a drink.
So you could not possibly have introduced my question better if we'd planned it. So I'm extremely impressed.
Yeah.
Because as I was listening to this conversation, one of the things that I kept thinking about was when we talk about applying AI to the professions, to things that involve a certain exercise of discretion, we have a few examples, right? We have medical diagnostics, we have sentencing and judging, and we have, Peter gave this example right on the battlefield and using killer robots to make decisions and that sort of thing. But in my view, there's something unique about medical ethical decisions because you have the possibility that the patient's going to get better. You have an external check on whether or not you've made the right decision in a way that you don't have with sentencing, in a way that you don't have with a battlefield decision. And so I wondered, from your perspectives, if you see a distinction in that medical ethical analysis because of patient outcomes as compared with exercising that type of discretion in other fields.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's one of the cornerstones of the ethics of care is the responsiveness, right? So both the verbal, like what a patient says, but yeah, but outcomes, right? And how does that affect overall populations who have certain things? And also to add to the previous question just a bit, I mean, there's also the legal discovery, but scientific discovery. Mm-hmm. So there's also a lot of research to be done on new cures for diseases, new drugs to be found. And there's been a lot of work in using AI to scan through scientific literature, looking for, you know, things between different studies that hadn't been noticed before that might indicate potentially valuable drugs or things like that. So I think there's a lot to be done there, and that could radically transform how we think about scientific publication and research and how we should disseminate knowledge through data sets and things like that, which I think is part of this question of what we really want is feedback loops. Right? For all of these systems to work, you need the error-correcting signal to improve over time, and that's what ultimately gives it power.
But it's an interesting paradigm that you pose. I mean, Nathan posed a very fundamental way of analyzing the utility of AI, you know, and does it improve net patient outcome? How would you transpose that to a trial?
I think
whose outcome are we talking about? So there may be analogies that don't quite work between the professions, but we got enough on our plate just dealing with machine medicine. Okay.
Joelle wants to.
I think we have a responsibility to establish a baseline for outcomes in all of these cases. And it may not be easy, but I think we have that responsibility. I've seen some legal cases where they do attempt to do this, for example, using AI systems for deciding on who gets bail and who doesn't. And in that case, they have clear indication of whether the bail was granted in a way where the person met the conditions of the bail or not, and they can measure that over a particular time period and articulate an outcome. I don't know what it would be in terms of weapons and so on. I think in that case, you know, we'd have to think about what it is, but I think that's a fair question to ask in all the cases of using automation, and in particular of how we decide to incorporate the automation in a complex system.
And I would just say that measuring patient outcomes is not easy either in any, you know, and what it should be relative to what, you know, so there's a lot of complexity there. It's not so straightforward, but yeah.
Well, let me draw this to a close and invite suitable thanks to be given to our wonderful panelists.
Yeah.